Good morning and happy Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or whatever day of the week it is when you're listening to this. And I hope you're having a great week so far. And I want to say thank you for watching or listening to us wherever it is that you are. If you don't know yet who I am, I'm your host, Clarence Moore, and this is the Aligned, Engaged, Fulfilled podcast. On the show, we challenge the status quo of work culture, and we dive into the changes that we need to make to build transformative careers and human-centric workplaces where people and purpose drive the profits, not the other way around. And we're not just talking about surface level do's and don'ts. We're talking about mindset shifts and doing the deep, hard work. We're building the future of work, people. So if you haven't already, please subscribe, follow, rate, review, and share our podcast and engage in our community to help us do exactly that. Please help us make a wave because we all know that we need it. Today, we're navigating one of the most significant and really often challenging transitions in modern professional life, the career change. Bum, bum, bum. Our guest and our guide today is Caty Toro, a career strategist, fractional HR consultant, and a career change expert who has seen the hiring world from every angle. After more than a decade scaling teams in the tech, consumer, packaged goods, and finance industries, she now coaches thousands of high-achieving professionals to do something radical, find careers that work for their lives, not against them. She's a wife, a mom of two, and a firm believer that leadership is a mindset, that portfolio careers are more stable than you think, and that HR should be a strategic business unit, not just an administrative one. Our conversation today will go beyond the antiquated tactical advice of updating your resume and sending it into the void. We're going to deconstruct the deep connection between our identity and our careers, explore how to use your career as a medium to create the life that you want, and provide actionable advice for anyone feeling stuck and ready for a change. Caty, thank you so much for being here with us this morning and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to have this conversation.
Me too. I've been looking forward to this since we booked the episode, so I want to get right into it. But before we dive into the nuts and bolts of career change, I want to start with a story from something that just recently happened to me, actually. I was at the Small Business Expo here in San Diego, I think it was last week, and I was sitting in a keynote session about thriving, not just surviving. And the speaker asked the audience, she said, "How many of you are working in corporate right now?" And the room was quiet. It was crickets. Then she asked, "How many of you just left your corporate job to start your own business?" And Caty, let me tell you, the room exploded. It felt like about 80% of the hundreds of people in that room had just made the leap. And it was the first time that I saw the tangible real world proof of what we've been hearing about online every day. The mass exodus from what a lot of us perceive as toxic corporate culture and into entrepreneurship. So, of course, when I posted about this, someone commented, maybe it's just confirmation bias. And they argued that we're just seeing what we want to see. So I want to start right there. You, in all your experience, have really a unique 360-degree view of all of this. You're coaching people who are leaving their jobs and consulting for the very companies that are trying to hire and retain them. So from your vantage point, is this great resignation into entrepreneurship real, or are we, as that commenter suggested, just caught in a confirmation bias bubble?
That's a really interesting question because and I'm a data person, I like looking at the data.
Yeah.
It shows that portfolio careers are on the rise. And I think I want to say like 20% of Gen Z and 35% of millennials have some sort of side gig or portfolio career. And when you look at the engagement rates at organizations globally, the engagement rate is below 22%, which is at like an
Right.
all-time low
Yeah.
since 2009. So I think it can be confirmation bias because I don't know if you went to that expo to network with other entrepreneurs. So maybe that's what everybody was there to do. But I think the other portion is that we are at this crossroads, many of us in the workforce, where we realize that the careers that we built for a decade or more are just no longer serving us in the way that we originally thought. And it usually comes down to life changing events, right?
Hmm.
Having a new relationship, ending a relationship, starting a family, ending a relationship, going through divorce, a chronic illness, aging parents. And we kind of become the sandwich generation where, and sociologists will say it's the Gen X that are in this sandwich generation where you have aging parents and young kids. I think elder millennials are also gravitating towards that as well with aging parents and young kids and navigating all the stresses that come with life. And I think if COVID and the pandemic had not happened, I don't know if we would be in this little bubble right now. But I do think that due to the disengagement that employees are feeling, due to people wanting a little bit more control and autonomy, they are seeking something new. And that's where entrepreneurship and consulting can come in to bridge that gap to serve the life that they know that they want, that supports the lifestyle that they want
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, a lot of that resonates with me because I I left corporate world and really I worked in healthcare, so it was healthcare, but it had a lot of the same kind of corporate, not behaviors, but structure and things of that nature because we had nearly 200 employees, and for me, it was a life changing moment that changed the trajectory of what I wanted out of my career, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't really think about when they're starting to get in that feeling of maybe I'm not where I want to be. They don't really look that deep in terms of what are the factors that are influencing that. And I think for a lot of us, the pandemic was that, and then it layered on to all these other things that came out of the pandemic. So a lot of people that year or the year after the pandemic decided to get married, and then consecutively they started to have families, and I think all of that kind of domino effect all contributed to where we are now of everybody just reassessing where they are with their career, with their life, and what they want out of, the traditional workplace that we've all been so conditioned to function in. And, for me, and it's true for a lot of the, experts and thought leaders that I've spoken to, the pandemic was that catalyst for a lot of us that decided that we wanted to make that change. So I think that's a really fascinating perspective that I hope a lot more of our listeners really kind of pause and think about. But it leads to an even more complex layer that I want to add. So we have this powerful force of people really, voluntarily leaving corporate America and leaving their corporate jobs to seek fulfillment and autonomy. But I want to introduce a conflicting and very recent economic reality. Multiple reports from September are now indicating that the job market has tipped. For the first time in a while, we're officially at a point where there are more people looking for jobs than there are jobs available. So, this creates a really fascinating contradiction. And since we're all obsessed with labeling trends in the world of work right now, I'm calling this the duality paradox. It's a massive push of people quitting to bet on themselves, colliding with that statistical pull of a tightening, more competitive job market. So, it really seems like a high stakes game of musical chairs is about to begin. So, as someone who has their finger on the pulse of this from both the individual's and the company's perspective, what does that duality mean for the economy and the world of work? Might be a heavy question, but
Well, and
it's interesting, right? Like to see they are two opposing forces that are both true at the same time. So I'm curious to as to what you think that means for the future of the economy and the world of work.
yeah, it's, and we all make decisions based out of fear, right? Companies overhired in 2020, 2021, and a little bit into 2022. And then it became a very much employer driven market,
Yeah.
especially in the tech industry. So I do think that this depends on the industry that you are in because there's other organizations that are thriving and aren't they're thriving compared to having to quiet lay off people by return to office mandates, which is another strategy that a lot of these large organizations tend to do when they're trying to reduce headcount and reduce costs. So, but given my experience working within executive recruitment and also on the staffing side, these positions often don't just go away. They Meaning that they have the budget, but they don't necessarily have the headcount for the insurance, the benefits, the retirement package, which goes into play in terms of contract work and fractional and freelance consulting. And so, what I'm finding is that there are a lot of people that are active in their job search, meaning they are applying to open roles or they're getting reached out to by, executive recruiters or headhunters. And maybe the scope of work isn't like 100% match, but then people are pitching themselves, hey, I'm not a fit for this full-time role, but I would be willing to do this project on a contract or consulting basis. Would you be open to it? And companies are saying yes. So I do think that yes, there's going to be this duality where there's more people available for jobs in the traditional W-2 sense, but that doesn't mean that the work in those fields are going away.
Hmm. So, in the larger sense, in the broader sense of things, on one hand, does this give companies an advantage thinking that they can just wait for the people that quit to come back? Or on the other hand, does it mean that the top talent, the people who have the skills and the courage to bet on themselves and go take that leap, are now permanently off the traditional market? So, leaving a massive skill gap for companies to deal with.
I think there will be a massive skill gap in companies because these people that are the, quote unquote A players, high performers, believe in themselves enough to be able to make it work because they're the ones that are building, scaling, innovating, strategizing. They have the skills to be able to do this at a greater capacity with more autonomy, more flexibility, and likely more money than they were making just serving one company, right?
Yeah.
When you go into that freelance fractional world, you- there's so many more opportunities to not only work with businesses that are more aligned to your values, that are more aligned to your goals that you want to achieve, and gives you the flexibility and creative control that you might not get in a traditional corporate sense. So I do think that depending on what level these individuals are at, whether that be senior managers, directors, VPs, there is going to be a massive skill gap. And I know some companies are even trying to eliminate that middle management role, which I think is a huge disservice to organizations and employees because that middle manager is often the buffer between high level leadership. They're still producing, they are still responsible for their own results, but also overseeing a team. They have to get to the finish line. And so when you take that away, when you take that level away, it is mass chaos because people at the highest level don't know what people at the lower level are doing every day. And it's going to cause a huge communication and skill gap.
Yeah, well, I think you brought up a lot of really strong points there because it really, I mean, there's so much more layers that adds even more to the complexity of the current job market. Because if you think at all the things that are going on, we've got, to your point, this whole management crisis that is then paired with the younger generations fleeing from the management role,
Yeah.
itself,
Yeah.
with unbossing and climbing down the ladder and all those trends. And then we also have generative AI that is in coming into the picture or has come into the picture and taking away the repetitive tasks and really forcing us to redefine job descriptions and roles within an organization. So you have really this multi-layer, multi-dimensional complexity that is hitting us at every angle when it comes to the job market. So we painted the picture of really the current reality of all of that, and I'm avoiding those topics intentionally because we can go into so many different avenues. But we painted the picture of the reality that we're facing right now, and we have this massive, complex, dynamic duality. And really, duality isn't even the right word, but for the sake of this conversation, we'll focus on the duality between the um, the job market and having more people looking for jobs than jobs available, and the mass exodus of people leaving corporate. So we'll focus on that duality that is happening in the job market, and I want to ask the question of why. Like, to really understand it, I believe that we have to zoom in from the economy to the individual, because that's really where these trends are truly born. This leads to the very human why behind all of it. And so you work with presumably successful senior professionals, managers, directors, VPs, who, from the outside looking in, have already made it. Yet they come to you for a career change. What's the real and maybe even unspoken catalyst that drives a successful person to say, this isn't working for my life anymore?
That's a really good question. And I think it does depend on the individual. But I would say the commonality between all of the clients that are seeking something new and different at a season of their career where they're at a crossroads, right? Like they don't need to take another position to gain experience, to gain visibility, which is something that you do earlier on in your career to get exposure to senior leadership, to get exposure to these projects. But they're again, with COVID and the pandemic, we realized that in the large majority of office like positions, right? And there are some healthcare workers that I've worked with on the clinical side that want to make a transition, but they're not saving lives. They're working on computers, on projects, on marketing, on finance, in operations. And they realize that they can do this remote, and return to office mandates are requiring them to have to uproot their entire lives, or company headquarters have changed and they realize they don't want to do that. And it's usually because they're having an existential crisis in their own lives with personal life changing events like starting a relationship, starting a family, even having a kid go away to college, or again, dealing with those aging parents. It's an identity crisis, meaning they just like wake up one day and they realize, what am I doing this for? What am I doing this for? I just looked at a spreadsheet for 8 hours a day and like they don't listen to me. And so they're feeling bitter and resentment, and they also feel guilty. They also feel shame. They also feel like they just wasted years of their life performing, and they don't want to perform anymore.
Yeah.
They want to be authentic. They want to be themselves. And sometimes this corporate mask that we all feel like we have to put on to be successful, um, because most people are addicted to external validation because humanness, our ego, loves it. But I help them reframe to get grounded confidence in their abilities and what it is that they actually want to fit the life that they want. Because I believe that jobs are what we do, not who we are. And it is a part of our identity, for sure. But there's also other parts of our identity. And oftentimes, as you're growing your career, I consider this in like a decade, the first 8 to 10 years, you're doing nothing but proving yourself through production, external validation, getting these accolades, getting these promotions. And I have the belief that growth does not have to be linear. Growth does not have to be, climbing the ladder. It can mean a jungle gym. It can mean whatever it is that you want it to mean. But we build on a foundation. And those foundational skills that you've developed, gained, and earned throughout your career can be used elsewhere.
Yeah. Well, I think something that comes to mind when you say that is imposter syndrome. Because I truly believe that imposter syndrome comes from us being in a place where let me backtrack. I feel like oftentimes when we talk about imposter syndrome, people think about it as I don't think I'm qualified to be here. I don't think I'm meant to be here. But I have come to learn from my experience that imposter syndrome can also come from a place of, is this really what I want? Is this really, where I want to be? And so, let's talk a little bit about that because as, these senior leaders start to contemplate that leap, or really anybody, one of the biggest hurdles that you help them overcome is imposter syndrome. Why is it that the more successful someone becomes, the louder that voice of self-doubt can get during a major career transition? Like what are people really afraid of?
And this is just my theory. I think it's they have this attachment to feeling needed. And when you
Hmm.
reach a certain level, you are needed not only by your senior leadership, or if you are working for a publicly traded company, you have the shareholders to think about. And if you're leading a team, you're all of a sudden responsible for developing your team. And good leaders want to develop their team, but they become attached to feeling needed. And so when that foundation cracks, everything else starts to it's almost like a domino effect. And I'm sure you've experienced this in your career, Clarence, where you have one bad leader maybe going through a personal situation and like self-doubt, it affects every single person you work with because they're second guessing their own talents and abilities, which makes their
Yeah.
team second guess their talents and abilities, which makes leadership distrust them or think, whoa, that was a little off. Like, I don't know why they decided that. And it affects everything. So I think it's this attachment to feeling needed, and also afraid of pivoting because they've built a reputation. Built they've built their career on this external validation.
Yeah. Well, to your point, it is something that resonates so deeply with me because I've experienced it in my career. And I know that it's very central to yours too. So I think this would be a powerful moment to pull the curtain back a little bit before we dive deeper into the strategy of it all. Could you share a bit of your own story? How did you get to this point in
Yeah.
your career?
Yeah. So I grew my career in recruiting, staffing, executive recruitment, and I made strategic moves in my career. My customer group, my client group has always kind of been senior leaders and executives. And when I made the move to in-house corporate from third-party agency, I knew I wanted to get into HR. That was actually I studied finance in college, but when I realized I did a finance internship, I did a marketing internship, and I realized finance is not the direction for me. I don't think I'm creative enough to do marketing, but like I like business, I like strategy, and HR was something that I felt called to. So I knew strategically I wanted to get into an HR function, and I had the ability to do that. But as I was growing my career, this was probably 8 years ago, personal circumstances. My mom was diagnosed with lung cancer. My husband and I were trying to start a family. We went through infertility and loss. Then my dad was diagnosed with cancer. Luckily, they're both in remission now, and are healthy. But instead of dealing with any of those things, I was such at an impressionable age and working with leadership that instead of taking a beat and realizing what was important to me, I just threw myself into work. And throwing myself into work, I work 70 to 80 hours a week. I was I was again getting the recognition, I was getting those promotions, and I had a female director basically tell me as I started my healing journey and going to therapy and realizing, okay, maybe this isn't the direction I want to go. She's like, well, you basically need to choose between your next promotion or if you want to have a family, then that's probably gonna um, you're not gonna have a spot here anymore. And it was in that moment that I was like, watch me. I can have a career and I can have a family, and I do not need a company telling me what I can and cannot do with my life. And so I had networked my way through a mutual connection. Actually, my first boss out of my first job in college introduced me to her friend from college. And they had a director of recruiting role at a financial institution. And because of my finance degree, I just felt like it was a good fit recruiting,
Hmm.
financial professionals.
Yeah.
I took a big pay cut because the pace of work was so different. The industry was so different. It was more employee first, like human first, employee second mentality.
Mm.
And I made the shift when I was 11 weeks pregnant, and my son is going to be 6 soon. So I, it was a strategic move and it was risky. I left a great benefit package for a huge pay cut, less benefits, but I gained the fulfillment, and I knew that and truly it was the catalyst for me being an entrepreneur because I was recruiting basically business owners and working with career changers. And, but because of that, I didn't want to recruit anymore. I tell this to all of my clients, like, you couldn't pay me $1 million to go back into a recruiting role because it was so production heavy. Even though it was
Yeah.
a different pace of life, it was still based on production. And I have the belief that recruiting should be a mutual selection experience. And I
Yeah.
didn't want to be compensated in a way that forced people into a process that did not fit with them, that did not align with them. So I love the work that I was doing and helping decide if this is a good fit. But I didn't love getting people across the finish line into a role that I knew wasn't going to be a good long term fit for them. And so, long story short, burnout happened. I was traveling for work. My husband was traveling for work, 2 kids under 2. It just wasn't what I wanted. And after infertility, I didn't want to miss those like informative years. So I was like, I think I can do this part time. I think I can transition to doing career coaching part time. And then as I healed, I had more capacity to work more full time. And that's where I unintentionally built this portfolio career for myself because in order to bridge the gap for career coaching, I started doing some recruiting and HR projects. And it's been so fulfilling. I love variety in my work. I get to choose when and where I work now. And I have a creative outlet for me, which was so cathartic growing up in this conditioned system to where you have
Yeah.
to look and perform a certain way. I don't have that anymore. So that's a very long story about my journey and how I decided to go off on my own.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. About how long was that journey for you?
So I I had my daughter in 2021, and when I returned to work in January of 2022, I knew, like, something in my bones was like, "This isn't right anymore." I couldn't describe it. Like, I loved being my identity. When you talk about identity, my identity was being a working mom. I love that I had the flexibility after, my son was born because it was COVID, and I felt like I was on top of the freaking world. I thought that I could do anything. We didn't have daycare. My husband and I were like, and we're both so client focused that we were just like tag teaming. But I realized I can get done in what would take an 8 hour day in the office and 3 to 4 hours at home. My productivity skyrocketed. I had the best years during that time. And then when we started kind of going return to office, I would wake up at 5 a.m. just to get my kids out the door by 7:30, an hour commute both ways, 30 minutes to drop off, an hour sometimes to get to the office. So sometimes it was an hour and a half depending on traffic. And then I'd have to rush out at 4 to get home, drive an hour back to get them by daycare pickup. And it was exhausting. And I was like a shell of a human. And so it wasn't until 2023 where I just hit a breaking point where I was like, this is it. I can't do it anymore. Can't do it anymore. And it was I shouldn't say it's a clean slate. I had a very long and I was getting groomed for a promotion. So all of this being said, Clarence, I had asked for a promotion and I was literally getting groomed for a promotion. And I what was so hard for me to admit, and this is what my mentor and coach said to me, just because you can fight through it doesn't mean that you have to anymore. And that was the permission slip that I didn't know that I needed, that it was okay for me to pivot and admit that what I thought I wanted was actually not what I wanted anymore. And that's okay. But I was terrified to admit that going back to the attachment because I felt like my team needed me, my company needed me. If I'm not a working mom, then who am I? If I'm not this leader, who am I? And it was an identity crisis. And it was a journey and it still is a journey. But it was probably a year and a half of me fighting through this, um, conflict and disruption and having the intuition and grounded confidence that I knew it was time.
The reason why I ask is, I mean, I think for a lot of people, it's kind of that 1 to 5 year period before they make the exit where they're really battling with that. I mean, I know for me, it was since the pandemic through and then through
Yeah,
2025. So it was about a 4 year process for me to
yeah,
really make the decision of it's time for me to walk away. But I ask because for most of the people that I've talked to about this kind of similar transition that they've made, typically comes at the kind of 15, 20-year mark of their career, which I think is fascinating because it seems to be pretty consistent across the board with people. And I think that what, the younger generations, Gen Z, is seeing is that, 15, 20 years that people put into this process before they realize the shift that they want to make and they don't want to have to spend that time. But, to kind of similar to your journey, mine was, just as messy. I think my entire professional career was going through imposter syndrome every day, was
fake it
going
till
through
you
an
make
ide
it.
right, exactly. Well, yeah, that used to be my perspective, and then, maybe in the last 5 years, maybe, I shifted to just, do it till you make it, and that made a big difference, but I was really having an identity crisis my entire life, and I think there's so many factors that come into it. My family immigrated here from the Philippines. And so the pressure of being an immigrant and having to succeed in this new kind of life than what your parents had and repaying your parents and then at the same time trying to discover who you are in a different culture was a long process that I'm still trying to figure out. If you look at my career, my portfolio of my career, I went from working in fashion retail to working as a voice teacher and a piano teacher, and then I went into um, healthcare and wellness and leadership and like management, and it was just all over the place. And I never really had a moment in my life where it was slow. I always filled my days with as much as I could, and I think it was because I was trying to prove something to myself or trying to tell myself who I'm supposed to be, and I always chased the title. In this last company that I worked with, during my interview, I sat across from my interviewer and I said, I want to be manager as quickly as I can. What's the timeline? What do I need to do to get there in the shortest amount of time? And then every title change from there was a title change that I essentially demanded. And so my whole life was about building title over title over title. And then I finally got to a point where I was in the C suite and I was sitting there like, well, I'm here. Now what? And I really had to sit with myself to really discover the why behind it all. Like, why was I chasing that? Was it really just because everybody was telling us that we needed to do that? Or was it because that's just who I am or who I became? And just really sit in that and understand like why I was at the top of my game and still felt like I was not. Still felt like I was right back at the bottom looking for the next ladder to climb. And I think that that's a piece that a lot of people don't really spend time sitting in, like, and they just kind of keep going and they don't take a moment to really just catch a breath and really ask themselves why. And so it brings us back to the deep connection between identity and work. And the reason why I say, we've talked about this, and I talk about this often, but I don't believe in this whole your job is not your identity piece. And it's not that I'm saying your identity has to be attached to your title, but I think it's the same belief of yes, your job is not your identity, but I think it's just asking the wrong question of why does your job not feel like it aligns with your identity. So I think it's just a reframe of the same kind of argument,
Yeah.
but there is such a deep connection between your identity and work. And so for a lot of people, for example, when we go back to what we're facing now with people leaving corporate world to go into their own self-employment, but for a lot of people, that career change feels terrifying because it is perceived as a loss of identity, and or at least an identity that they've associated themselves with for so long. How do you coach a client to untangle their sense of self-worth from their job title so that they can make a clear-headed decision about what it is they truly want next?
It's a great question. And I kind of developed my own 3D method where I talk about being able to disconnect, detach, and divorce yourself from the actual job itself. Because when most of my clients come to me, when I say like beyond crisp, they are beyond crisp. They start their day looking at their email, they start their day in fight or flight mode, like immediately their heart is racing, their brain is spinning, and they don't give themselves any space. And then even when they're done with work, they're constantly refreshing their email or taking work calls after hours in between their kids' soccer games, and like they don't give themselves space. So the first part is disconnecting, and it's really easy to shut your laptop off and not look at your email or not look at your
Yeah.
phone, but that doesn't mean that you're not thinking about it. And so you have to basically create a ritual for yourself of like, I'm shutting down. And maybe it's shutting your laptop and lighting a candle, or maybe it's shutting your laptop or putting your phone in another room and putting on a song to signal home life. And that's the hard part because it's really easy to, and you have to create environments for yourself. I am a huge social media is part of my job now, but I have the Opal app to block apps during certain times to make sure that I'm not doom scrolling because work never stops. And then the second part is really being able to detach yourself from that emotional and energetic attachment to feeling needed. We have this attachment to feeling needed, but it's okay to go to the gym without checking your email for an hour. It's okay to go to your kid's soccer practice or dance class or whatever and not feel like you have to like take all of these calls. And then it's the divorce part of like letting go and saying goodbye to the previous version of you that is not serving you. And that's the identity shift. That's what I talk about in the divorce, because sometimes it's not even actually leaving the job. It's leaving the version of you that started in that job,
Yeah.
because we're humans, we're supposed to evolve. So if you're the same person 5 years later, something's off. Like really something's off.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
supposed to grow, you're supposed to evolve, you're supposed to be learning. So that's kind of what I teach about, like being able to decenter your career. It's really through this like 3D method. And you have to be able to set your environment up to allow yourself for success.
Hmm. Well, I think you touch on quite a few important things. Like, there's so much in terms of our need to be needed, that is rooted in, the world of psychology, with Adlerian psychology and Maslow's hierarchy, both of which talk about, contributing to community, contributing to society, and the need to, be filled with, relationships and social connection. That I think a lot of people who were like, um it, making this exodus from corporate, of like, you don't need all these people, like, that they miss, like. And I think that's, where, when we talk about how we're going to change corporate culture or corporate world, like, we really need to look at those types of things, because we make decisions where we're like, okay, the answer is, get rid of the 9 to 5 or get rid of blah blah blah, but we forget that there are innate human needs that we have to take into account. But to your point, I think that it does come down to understanding how to navigate it, in terms of, it maybe isn't about, okay, having to change the thing altogether, but understanding that you've changed from who you were when you started at that place, and you need to adapt. And that's where I think people really need to dig into, to really understand how to make that kind of transition.
Self leadership. It's self
Yeah, it is
leadership.
absolutely self leadership. Yeah. And so this conversation about identity and behavior highlights a critical distinction that I try to explore in my work, which is the difference between values and virtues. And I think we talked about this a little bit, before, but we all have this list of values, the things that are important to us, the things that, make us who we are, like integrity, creativity, balance. And these are all part of our desired identity. But virtues are different. Virtues are lived, demonstrated behaviors that prove that those values are real. And I believe that the core of misalignment, whether for a person or for an entire organization, is a gap between what their stated values are and their practiced virtues, right? We say, for example, that we value balance, but then our virtuous behavior is that we go and we work for 12-hour days. And that's where burnout is born, in that gap. So for you, Katie, like, how do you see that value virtue gap show up with your clients? How do you coach them to move beyond just identifying their new career values, and help them architect the daily behaviors and virtues that will actually bring those values to life?
Yeah, that's a common theme that I also see with my clients, is that they say that they want more balance and then they work over the weekend because they got an urgent request on a Sunday. And I'm like, that's
Yeah.
a direct like violation of what it is
Right.
that you said that you wanted.
Right.
And they're like, I know, but they just needed it. And so I do think that, and here's what I also think with that burnout gap that you mentioned, Clarence, is that it's not just about the hours of work that you're putting in. It's not just working 12 to 14 hours. It's actually doing something that you're no longer aligned with. And I
Yes.
think that is the gap of saying, yes, you want balance. Yes, family is your priority, but then you're constantly missing kids events or family events because of work. I've had clients that are at the high level VP chief level, and they're bringing their laptop to their kids' birthday parties. They're taking phone
Mm,
calls on vacation because they have this attachment. So it's a direct violation and conflict of what it is that they say they want versus how they're actually behaving. And to your point, you do have to be able to change the behavior in order to make any change. The same, like insanity is the definition of doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. So if you say your
yeah.
value is balance, but then you're not doing anything to change the balance that you have in your life, nothing's ever going to change. You have to create boundaries and standards for yourself and uphold that boundary.
Right. Yeah. And I will say, I asked that question not as somebody who perfectly lives this like identity of
Perfect.
having that balance, because I am just as much a victim to that behavior as anybody else. Like for example, like when I went into, my consulting practice full time, I intentionally set like rules and boundaries for myself. So I said I wouldn't work past 5 during weekdays, and I'd be home in time for dinner to spend time with my daughter. I wouldn't work on weekends, and it has not been perfect. Last night, for example, it was like 7 PM. My daughter was wanting to play, but I had to post a TikTok video because the algorithm and analytics say that the most engaged time that my followers are at on Thursday is 7 to 9 PM. And so there are these factors that almost like tempt us and force us to break our own rules and boundaries. But we do have to make that conscious choice. And it's a reminder that I have to tell myself every day. And I've even talked to my wife about like getting, there's these lock boxes that you can buy where you cannot access whatever you put in there for whatever amount of time you set it for, because you have to. And I think it reminded me of a quote from uh God, what is the book? It's Atomic Habits,
Yeah.
by James Clear, and he
Yes.
says that if you want to build certain habits, you have to create the environment that allows you to build those habits and forces you to create those habits until they are habits. And so I think, it's a good reminder that yes, we are all tempted. We are all victims to it. None of us can perfectly follow our own boundaries. But when you are conscious of it, you have to make a choice. And it comes down to that choice. You have to make a choice to fix that behavior.
Yep. And I love that you just shared that example because I like you said, we're all victims of it, right? We have these boundaries for ourselves and then something happens and we're like, "Ooh, but I want to check this."
Mhm.
Um 80/20 rule, right? Like if we can do that, if you cannot and I think of this myself, like I have boundaries for family time. But sometimes if the day doesn't go as planned, I have to be a little bit flexible. But if I'm only using that flexibility 20% of the time, that means the other 80% of the time, I'm upholding that standards that I set for myself. And I feel good about that because I think it's also hard when you are making these behavioral changes. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. And I think that there's room for some gray and fluidity. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to sustain it. And that's where the hard part is for people that are making emotional decisions. Um, they sometimes have immediate regret because they didn't think through all of it and then they can't sustain that or hold what it is that they said that they wanted and they want to immediately revert back to old ways. And I just have to remind my clients and myself, like, that's our brain's way of trying to keep us safe. No one likes, like, our brain doesn't like change. We have to train it to make sure that we're comfortable to sustain it. And that's
Yeah,
hard. It's hard work.
it absolutely. Well, and I think that it actually highlights and opens up the conversation to the other side of this whole identity and work conversation, is that, I mean, we can talk about work, the whole concept of work life balance, but I think we always think about work life balance in the sense of how do we keep them separate. But in reality, like there's no real way to separate the two, because even when you're at home and you're trying to set these boundaries, there are instances, I mean, especially for those who go into self-employment. If you leave corporate world to go into self-employment, I will tell you right now, you are guaranteed to have zero work-life balance no matter how hard you try, because you're trying to build something. You're trying to build something that resonates truly with who you are and what you want out of life and what you want for your family. And there are sacrifices and choices that you have to make that will close the gap of whatever you believe work life balance to be. And if you don't recognize that and accept that this work life balance notion is really, to quote Brett, who was on my previous episode,
Yeah,
it's a failed notion,
for
and
sure.
you truly are setting yourself up to fail. But it is having an awareness that you have to have flexibility. There has to be a give and take, because you're living one life, and that one life consists of different pieces that all come in at any given time. And if you don't recognize and accept that, you're going to pull yourself further from making progress.
Absolutely. And I say everybody has a different definition of success and everybody has a different
Yeah.
definition of what work life balance really means to them. And I
Right.
think to, to kind of like these themes are so overlapping when you think about the traditional 9 to 5. It was started by Henry Ford in the 1920s for his factory production workers when
Right.
primarily there was just one person in your household working.
Right.
The women were at home. And when more women were entering the workforce, it became this pressure to just like normalize this 9 to 5. And before computers, before laptops, before cell phones, like you really left work at work. Technology has changed that. So we are never truly off, but it's like we haven't updated our systems and society and expectations to also change with that. And that's the hard part. That's the hard part because you're right. Everybody has a different definition. And when you are building something, it does take short term sacrifice for long term gain.
That brings us to what I think is the key to being able to navigate and survive this whole process, which is strategy. Once a person has done that deep internal work on their identity, their values, their behaviors, they now have to re-enter what we've already established as a very tough job market. And this is where the strategy becomes critical. So the traditional job search advice feels incredibly outdated. It's very
Yep.
reactive.
Yep.
It's about polishing your resume, scrolling job boards, and waiting for a response. And people have been going about it in that way. And a lot of them have been waiting months, maybe even years, and have applied to hundreds of jobs to no avail. I know someone who has a spreadsheet of all the jobs they've applied to, and it's like hundreds and hundreds with zero success. So I think it's time to challenge the antiquated system. So, for the sake of this part of the conversation, we'll focus on three major components: the search process, the resume, and the interview.